Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome everybody to the Latin American Studies Program's Public Issue Forum at Cornell University. It's a very difficult time for a lot of people with social distancing, but we're doing our best to maintain some of our academic programming in the midst of the pandemic and the social distancing requirements. And in particular, we wanted to have a discussion today about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic within Latin America itself. And so we're very fortunate to have with us a program that we're calling Latin America and the Pandemic: Social Issues and Government Responses. And we have with us to talk about different countries within Latin America a number of our graduate fellows, PhD and master's students in Latin American Studies at Cornell University. Actually, they're students in a wide range of different fields, but part of the Latin American Studies program. And so they will be talking to us today about the impact of the virus and the social effects, as well as the public health effects, and then the government responses within their own countries. And so before I turn over to that, just a couple of very quick announcements related to the program. First of all, just to let you know that we have a film coming up on, Bill, can you remind me, I believe is it May the 8th on La Salada?
Correct, May 8th.
May 8th is part of the film series, and we will show the film and then have commentary and discussion led by one of our graduate fellows, John Kennedy. All right, so that is coming up on May the 8th. And otherwise, also a quick announcement that we will be putting out a call for applications this week for anyone who would like to apply to be a graduate fellow with the Latin American Studies program next year. So you can check the Latin American Studies website, and the application information will be present there. Okay, so with that much said, let me now introduce one of our graduate fellows, Daniel Dawson, who is going to be the moderator for the panel forum today, and then we'll go ahead and introduce the other graduate students that will be part of the discussion today. So I thank everyone for joining us.
All right, thank you, Ken. Hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Dawson. I'm a PhD student in the history department, and I'm also one of the last fellows. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. Just a few reminders before we get started on the presentations. I want to remind everyone to keep your mics on mute if you're not speaking, just to reduce background noise, that type of thing. I think everybody's muted automatically, but just as a reminder. And then also we are going to be doing a question and answer type thing. So on the bottom of the screen in Zoom, there should be a Q&A tab. So please send in if you have questions during the presentations, please send in your questions through that function, that Q&A function at the bottom. And then we're going to go through all the questions at the end and address them at the very end, rather than cutting in and out between presentations. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to our invited speakers. So our first speaker today is Javier Jaimes, who is he holds a PhD from Cornell in microbiology, and is currently a postdoctoral scholar studying the coronavirus. So Javier, take it away.
Thank you, Dan. So let me just start sharing my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, so I guess we are all now in this. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. So the idea of today is just to give you like small contextualizing about this global issue that we are facing now. I'm just going to go through a couple of slides just to mention how the virus is spreading around the world, some of the characteristics and some basic concepts that you might need to know to understand what is happening with the virus. So I'm a member of a group that study how coronaviruses infect cells. I'm working with Dr. Gary Whitaker, who is a professor here at the vet school, and we have been studying this thing for several years. So we do have some like knowledge about these viruses and how they actually like behave around the world. I just want to make a disclaimer, a small disclaimer, just for you to know that this we are facing a situation where everything is changing like every day, like going really fast, and we really wanted you to know that um, things can change from the one day to the other. So it is important for you to know that this presentation is going to be up to date until today, like April 27th. And some things may change, some things will stay as they are, but this is important for you. So this is a reference, so you can know that it is important for you for look for further information, and you can go to these organizations that could have up to date information from you. And also, if you are concerned about your health, about whatever could be happening to you, and you really are like thinking that you might be infected or something like that, it's important that you visit your physician or contact the Department of Health so you can have your questions answered. So let's talk about the COVID-19. So this COVID-19 started last year, actually about December 12th. That was the first reported case in Wuhan, mainland China, where they did the first report that this virus was appearing there as a pneumonia case. And this outbreak was associated with a live animal market. And you might have learned about this market where they actually have live animals, dead animals, and a lot of people in just one place, which is kind of like the perfect mix to actually allow virus to evolve. However, we still don't know if that was the actual origin of the virus. We still don't know if that was the place where the virus first appeared in humans. About the beginning of this year, we had information about the sequence, about the genetic, and we actually had access to the virus. Sorry, and this virus at that time was identified as the 2019 novel coronavirus, 2019 NCOV. But then on February, the International Committee of Taxonomy of Viruses decided to change the name and name the virus SARS-CoV-2. And the World Health Organization decided to change the name of the disease and call it COVID-19. And I'm just mentioning this because you might have seen those names, that this is quite confusing sometimes. So SARS-CoV is the virus that is causing the disease, and COVID is the actual disease that we are facing now. Okay. So at today we have almost 3 million cases reported, and this was updated about an hour and a half ago. And as you can see, this is actually spread all around the world, and there are countries that are having most of the cases. Of course, U.S. now is the one that has the majority of those cases, and the majority of deaths that are around 200,000 cases. That is somehow below the 1% of deaths. So this is so 1%, sorry, 10% of the cases, which is kind of like concerning if you see that this is something that is actually like causing problems in humans, and is actually make them like suffer like kind of like a nasty disease that sometimes ends in the death. Most of the cases, and when I say most of the cases, I'm talking about 80% or even higher that of the cases are actually asymptomatic or mild symptomatic. So it means that those people that have the virus actually are not going to show any clinical signs or any big clinical signs, and that's concerning because most of these people are not going to access to diagnostics, and of course they are not going to access to actually to fill this information and let us know what is the actual numbers that we are facing with the virus. So just for you about the origin, because I want to make clear about this, because there's a lot of theories, a lot of conspiracy theories. We are actually pretty much clear that the virus has an origin in a wild reservoir, and these wild reservoirs are common for coronaviruses. So several coronaviruses have their reservoirs in wild animals, and those wild animals are mostly bats. So bats are known to have these coronaviruses and transmit these coronaviruses among their population without having like a huge disease. And sometimes those viruses can jump to intermediary hosts and those hosts will bring the virus to humans. And we have seen these things with SARS in 2002. We saw it again in 2012 with MERS, with the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, when the virus passed to a camel and then went to a human. And now we are facing a similar situation when we know the virus has an origin of the bat, but we still don't know which are, if there is an intermediary host that is passing the virus from these bats to humans. So we have, probably you have heard about pangolins. We are pretty much sure that pangolins are not the species, but still we are missing one piece here, if there is a piece there. But the important thing for you to know is that all the genetic origin that I'm trying to show you here is telling us that the viruses, that all these SARS-CoV-2 viruses has an origin in bats. So there is no conspiracy, there is no lab adapted virus or anything like that. And this has happened in several times in several viruses, including in viruses like the common cold, this NL63 or this OC43 or this 292E, 229E, sorry. These are viruses that are usually around us, that they are causing the common cold, and they also have an origin in wild reservoirs. So what is a virus? And I know that you are probably wondering what is this virus, and I know that most of you probably are from different fields. So viruses are actually these really tiny and simple systems that can replicate using the cell machinery. And why are they needing this cell machinery? Because they are only built by a genome and a protein cover that is actually protecting the genetic information. Sometimes, like in this coronavirus, they have an extra layer that is built with fat molecules that come from the cell. And that's the reason, because this virus is so easily destroyable with soap or any disinfectant, because this membrane is really easy to break. But what I want to mention is that these are really simple systems that can only replicate using cells. And that's the reason why they need to infect cells. And they are pretty diverse. And in the case of coronaviruses, there are several kinds of coronaviruses infecting several species. And this is what you have probably seen around. This figure you have probably seen it around. What it's showing us is the actual virus. This gray part is the membrane, this fat molecule membrane. And these red things are the spikes that are giving the name corona, that means crown in Latin. And that's the reason why we call this virus coronavirus. And as you can see here, these viruses are in several species. I'm sorry this slide is in Spanish. I didn't want to change it because this is how it was published. But again, this virus is common in dogs, cats, pigs, humans. These viruses are actually pretty distributed in several species. And in humans, we also have like several coronaviruses infecting us. Most of them are respiratory. Some of those are neurological, but most of the viruses are respiratory disease. How this virus is transmitted, I know you know that the virus is transmitted through the airway. So when people is sneezing or coughing, is releasing the virus to the environment, and this virus is going to go to surfaces, and in those surfaces, the virus is going to be easily destroyed over the time. And some of those particles are going to fly in the air and can reach other people that are close to each other. And that's the way as the virus is getting transmitted to other people. And this is just to mention, because I mentioned this because at the very end, I'm going to mention about the social distancing, and that's something that I want you to clear, that this virus is released to the environment, but as you can see in the figure, the higher the distance, the smaller are the particles, so the lower is the quantity of viruses that are reaching like far distances. And it's also known that some species can be actually susceptible to the virus. We know that the virus can easily transmit between humans, but also we know that the virus can go in other species like dogs, like cats, like either domestic or wild cats, even ferrets, and they are susceptible to get the virus in them to have some kind of replication. But as far as we know today, this is something that I want to mention, that I want you to get this thing really clear. As far as today, we don't have any evidence that the virus can jump from this species back to the human. So the virus is basically only going from the humans to this species. And what is it causing? It's causing basically a respiratory disease that usually is can also show other clinical signs, including digestive signs. And we know today we know that There are some other signs, including heart problems that can be associated with the virus, and this is actually like well known because of the way that the virus distributes in the body. But mostly we are having a respiratory disease because this is the way that the virus is getting into the body, and this is the place where it's replicating like in higher quantities. And just to end my presentation, I just want to mention what I just mentioned before about how the clinical cases are distributed. We know that most of the cases, about 80% of the cases, are non-symptomatic or mild symptomatic cases. These cases are actually usually less contagious, and they do not need any medical treatment, but those cases are usually the source of contamination to other people because these people usually don't know that they are infected. They don't know that they have the virus. They don't get tested, so they can transmit without knowing. The lower percentage of the people, like about 10 to 15%, are actually suffering severe symptoms, and they do need hospitalization. Some of those are going to need ventilation or ICU treatment, and a lower percentage is going to die about because of this virus. And we are estimating that the mortality rate with this virus is going to be something between the 1 to 2%. We still don't know because we don't know how many people is actually infected, because we don't know how many people is in this group. So this is just to mention that all the measurements that we are doing and all the measurements that the countries are doing are trying to actually reduce this many people to transmit the virus to these few people that is actually pretty much susceptible and that is going to be needing this medical treatment. And this is the people that is going to die because there's no access to those medical systems when they are collapsed because everybody's going there at the same time. And that's the reason why we keep talking about this flattening the curve, because what is actually doing this with the social distancing is trying to avoid to all the people get sick at the same time, try to spread this infection during like most time as we can, so the health system doesn't get collapsed and people can access to the health services when they need it. So that's the reason why we are just talking about this flattening the curve and this social isolation system. So again, I just mentioned to you that this COVID-19 is a disease caused by this virus, the SARS-CoV-2. Coronaviruses are well-known foes, and we know that they are very diverse. Most of those have wild reservoirs, and they can jump to other species, including human. And in humans, the virus is mostly respiratory and is easily transmitted through direct contact. We know that there are other species that might be susceptible to the virus. And we also know that this virus can actually, we are thinking that this virus can actually turn to be a more like seasonal thing. So social distancing measures is the only tool that we have now to try to prevent the spreading of the disease. So with that, this is my lab. I just want to thank you, everybody. And I guess I pass the turn to the next person. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Javier, for that overview on the current situation with the coronavirus. Next, we will be hearing from Carlos Mesa Guerra, who is another one of our last fellows, as well as a PhD student in regional science. And he will be speaking on the situation in Colombia.
Thank you, Daniel. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the measures that the government has been putting up through this pandemic. And I just want to give you a general view of what's going on in Colombia. These are the figures that were updated yesterday. We have over 5,000 confirmed cases of coronavirus. Over 1,000 have been recovered, and around 240 deaths have been recorded in Colombia. As you know, and these figures are showing, and I put on a caveat. Basically, this depends on the testing capacity, but at the time, this just reflects time view of what's going on in parts of the country, while the testing capacity goes to the farthest region in it. We see basically same patterns that many countries where most of the treatment is done at home. We have about over a third of the capacity of ICUs and hospital beds being used at the moment. But when we compare this in an international view or a regional scale, we see that overall Colombia has been doing pretty well. When we see, for example, the graph in the different countries in Latin America, we see that the daily confirmed deaths per million, if we have a rolling 7-day average, it's okay relative to other countries. However, as I said, this is just shows a perspective of testing capacity and social distance measures that have been going through. So Colombia had the first reported and confirmed case on March 6th, and the government started the quarantine, a national quarantine on March 25th, which is effective until May 11th. It was supposed to end today, but the government decided to extend the quarantine until May 11th. Basically, it's a nationwide ban on restrictions on free movement of people and vehicles. You can only People can only go outside to buy personal products, go grocery shopping and stuff, but only one member per family. You can walk the dog, for example, but only 20 minutes around your house, or you can go to take care of your if you have any medical issues or whatsoever, and you can also go out. There are only priority workers exempt from these restrictions. People on the front lines, veterinaries, grocery workers, and other kind of priority sectors. However, schools, university, bars, and non-essential commerce remain closed for the moment. And these are basically the overall measures. And then I'm just gonna give you a little bit detail on what's happening starting from today. But the Colombian government has also decided to close all borders, and there will be no international national flights until the end of May, which is very restrictive in terms of not only international movement, but also on national movement on not only passengers, but also goods. In Colombian constitution, there is an article that says that if you don't comply with government measures and you put people into risk, you may carry a criminal penalty. So that's something I also wanted to say a little bit about, because in Latin American countries and in Colombia, where you have different government capacities at the regional level and at the local level, it's sometimes difficult to make people comply with these measures. As we will see, part of the problem is we have a large informal sector, a lot of people dependent on daily income, which when you face a national lockdown, when you put people into confinement, it is sometimes difficult to put into place a wide system of transfers from the government to the households that can keep people out of work for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or more on hour. So on the last slide, I will show, I will pose up a questions in terms of regional disparities and how the government in Colombia and other Latin American governments can try to work out these disparities in terms of quality of jobs and the income that these high-risk workers face. So as we have seen in many news, this virus, then the pandemic decreed, and then we make people cease any type of contact within each other. We went into a lockdown. This unveiled into not only a social and health issue, but also an economic recession. And what we have seen in Colombia is a projection that the economy will go down as far as between 2.5 and 7% of GDP growth in this year. So the government has unveiled around 3.7 billion, which is 1.5% of GDP, in measures that could counter not only the economic but the social effect of the pandemic. And these include giving cash transfers for most vulnerable households, which sum up about 3 million households in Colombia, VAT rebatements for the poorest, tax deferral for companies, and financial support for small and medium enterprises, which is not only on giving them credit capacity, but also on being able to provide financial resources to provide payment for their workers as they to avoid a lot of people going into unemployment. However, we have been into quarantine since about 4 weeks, and the economic consequences are starting to unravel. So the Colombian government decided, although they decided to extend the quarantine generally, from today, construction and manufacturing industries can begin reopening with strict safety measures. And basically, this has been done because when you look at the labor data, you see that about 30% of the employed population, which is about 6.6 million, are considered of high risk. And what does it mean to be considered of high risk? Are workers which are from non-priority sectors, no medical sectors, no grocery workers or other kind of essential workers, and that have or are considered with few possibilities for adaptability in these times. So there are workers which basically, if they don't go out to work, they don't receive any source of income or transfer, they are basically not going to be able to support themselves. So when you see these kind of figures in a country like Colombia, then you see that sectors like construction, which today is a non-priority sector, has a lot of people in informal contracts, and also people that are very, very difficult to adapt and to go to other different sectors. So some of these measures of easing up and trying to reopen some parts of the economy are basically looking at this population which is considered to be high risk in terms of incomes and job adaptability. And I just wanted to finish with what I posed a couple of minutes ago, and it's regional disparities on what the government capacity is at the local levels. And for example, we see places like Amazonas department, which is similar to an US state, basically in its capital city, Leticia, with high number of cases per million and number of deaths per million, relative to the largest city in the country, which is Bogota, which is around 8 million, and it's 10 or 12 times those in other parts of the country like Amazonas. But we see Amazonas, Santa Marta, Cartagena, places where sometimes you have a low quality of the health system and a low capacity, having a lot of contagious and a lot of deaths relative to other places in the country, which is something that you don't see when you look at overall country figures. And when you look deeper, those are the kind of things that government need to balance. And I'm gonna say that for now and move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Carlos, for your presentation. Next, we will be hearing from Tessie Schlosser, who is a PhD student in the government department, and she will be talking about the situation in Mexico.
Hi, I'll share my screen. I just have a very, very short PowerPoint presentation. So, I think one of the things, or one of the most important things, or the one thing that I want to focus on today is the challenge that Mexico has faced particularly in the transition to the government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So the challenge is, so AMLO has, on the one hand, addressed the situation in following with regulations and advice posed by the international medical community. At the same time, one of the important challenges is to not the focus that is needed when the economic situation is like one of Mexico, and especially with the capacities of the state. So as reported today, we have 14,677 confirmed cases. Then of those tested, 45,000 negatives, 7,612 suspicious one, 1,300 deaths. Of those, almost 60% are men, 40% women, and also 40% of the cases have been hospitalized, and 60% have been ambulatory. And as we see, kind of the curve is a little bit supposedly flattening, but we have entered phase 3, and so there's kind of 3 elements to AMLO's response that have had counterintuitive effects too, or sometimes on the one hand positive effects, on the other hand have created tensions. So the first, so in terms of political communication, because of the situation and because of the limited resources available for the government, one of the measures was to come up with a creative response. This cartoon was made up. Her name is Susana Distancia. In Spanish, it's a play with words. It means a healthy distance, and it was distributed. There were different contests, cartoon contests among children in schools. Different people, everyone, the language of every single government official when referring to social distancing has been to talk about Susana Distancia, and so there's elements of political communication. This also has had the effect that it has. So everyone, when you talk with anyone in Mexico, people who are not necessarily following news closely, they do they have adopted the language of Susana Distancia, however. And so this general strategy of political communication, I think, has been successful because from the beginning, President Obrador created lines of constant daily communication. So in the style of Hello Presidente, he created a daily morning press conference where everyone is able to attend. And with the crisis, with the COVID-19 crisis, there were an additional 2 press conferences every afternoon. So one with the Subsecretary of Health, and then again with the president after. So we have 3 times a day, people from the government are addressing the general population in just national TV. And the Subsecretary of Health has had huge success. His strategy of communication has been patient. His tone is patient. He constantly defers to science, and the way that he communicates the crisis, and especially the way that he defends or he justifies the way that the Mexican government has decided to act, has been by specifically posing the challenges that a government like Mexico has to face. So rather than demanding similar measures than maybe richer countries could demand, so he justifies and explains why Mexico particularly has to take different measures that don't necessarily require a demand for everyone wearing masks, for example, which according, in yesterday's press conference, he particularly talked about masks and how that may work for countries with like more resources, but in the case of Mexico, a demand like only being able to go out in public with masks would create more chaos and would actually like address the situation. So there's a constant. Now, at the same time as someone like Lopez Gatell has constantly been pushing and supporting the rhetoric and the importance of science, we have the president of the National Council of Science and Technology talking about how the general regulation and the information given about COVID by quote unquote neoliberal science is fake, and how we should listen to the government rather than listening to the general media and general like regulations of what is happening. So why listen to the government and to our particular government? And one of those things is because we should code and understand that so much of the discourse around coronavirus is quote unquote neoliberal science. And so part of the strategy and part of the strategy of López Obrador has been to constantly address his own methods, or to constantly frame his own methods as diverging and diverting from the past, the neoliberal past that some people are nostalgic for. However, and this is the subsecretary of economics of trade, and recently there's been a push towards thinking of how to increase or how to address not only the public health crisis but also the coming economic crisis. And so finally, there hadn't been discussion or a conversation surrounding tax reform. Now there is. However, and I don't know if you can see it's in Spanish, but the optimal control of macro, micro, and sanitary economic framework. The new theoretical framework that he's referring to, which is aligned with AMLO's both push for an austere government and a supposed rhetoric of not raising taxes from anyone, is following the idea of Laffer's curve, which is basically neoliberal science in its best sense. So Laffer from Reagan's administration, and the theory of Laffer's curve, which is basically you lower taxes, therefore you revenue increases, and that is kind of very basic Reagan economics, just neoliberal science. And that is the economic framework that the Subsecretary of Economics is proposing the tax reform will follow. So in rhetoric, there's a constant rhetoric against neoliberal policy, against the neoliberal past, against neoliberal science, in order to ignore other ways in which the COVID crisis has been addressed by other countries. At the same time, when we actually talk about economics and the proposed economic tax reform, it is Laffer's curve that is mentioned, which is just neoliberal science. Finally, this tension between, on the one hand, being told to follow science, and especially the science that the government poses and the government proposes and the government abides by, and also kind of this junction between the use of certain terms and then what those terms mean. So the use of neoliberalism to refer to anything that has to do with anything that the president doesn't, the political economy that the president is going to renounce, and the actual facts or the distrust in that information has amounted to, recently, in one of the press conferences in the late evening or late afternoon press conferences, the chief Fabiana, the chief of nurses, came and gave this beautiful and very moving speech, trying to address the violence that everyone, the personnel, the health personnel, has been suffering because of their of the way that they dress in public. So because of the understanding, because of the lack of understanding on how contagion happens, personnel dressed in medical attire, medical and like nurse attire, have been like suffering increasingly so from violent attacks as a way to kind of in a kind of fear response to how they might be spreading contagion. And yeah, so kind of the yeah, so this is Mexico right now. And thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tessie, for that presentation. Next, we will be hearing from two of our current LASP fellows, Rafael Tojavo de Silva, who is a PhD student in musicology, and Jihani Hassoun, who is a graduate student in landscape architecture, and they will be talking to us about the situation in Brazil.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. My name is Rafael, and I'll just contextualize the situation in Brazil quickly. As we say, Brazil is not for the faint of heart, because not only we are having a sanitary crisis in the country right now, and an economic, potential devastating economic crisis, we also managed to add another factor in there, which is a quite substantial political crisis, which pretty much spells disaster for Brazil. I don't know if you've been following, but Minister Sergio Moro, which is the Justice Minister of Brazil, just decided to resign recently, which pretty much threw Bolsonaro's government into spiraling chaos. Moro was important because he pretty much epitomized the idea of in the popular imaginary, he epitomized the idea of pretty much combating corruption in Brazil, because he was the federal judge that was responsible for prosecuting President Lula and giving him a sentence and sending him to jail. So in the popular imaginary, he is the epitomization of justice. He has been constructed as that. And he was one of the key ministers in Bolsonaro government, lending credibility to the government. And with him coming out of the government and saying that Bolsonaro is attempting to interfere with the federal police, which is the equivalent of the FBI here in the United States, to pretty much block investigations that might hit his family. It's a pretty big accusation, and it might start a process of impeachment in Brazil. So, of course, in the mind of Bolsonaro now, there's nothing more important than staying in power. And of course, he's like thinking about his re-election in 2022. Therefore, the response for the coronavirus within the country, coming from the federal government especially, has been pretty much inexistent, to say so. Bolsonaro managed to shift the onus of the crisis to the government, to the state government, and he's not being very helpful at all. And that, of course, in a government such as Bolsonaro, where anything related to arts, education, and science, it's promoted as a leftist vehicle for ideology. Of course, the arts in general becomes the last thing in the list. And when we have a crisis such as this, the arts are the first one going into the crisis, and usually the last one coming out of the crisis. So in Brazil, it's quite contrasting, because in other countries you've seen, for example, in England, you've seen the the government intervening and making sure 160 million pounds would be available in aid for the arts. In Germany, um, they went even further, and within the 50 billion euro package that they decided to implement to aid small business, they also included the arts. They included artists, musicians, art galleries, museums, and so on and so forth. And out of this 50 billion, at least 500 million euros were distributed within the first week of the implementation of the program. Brazil hasn't seen anything like that. Actually, Brazil has seen a minister of culture that is absolutely hiding. She's been hiding um, from any responsibility. So the Brazil didn't really have a minister of culture. We have a special secretary of culture because Bolsonaro demoted the minister of culture to a subsecretary. Because of course he sees the minister. I mean, he sees the culture as a form of promoting leftist ideology. So he made sure to strangle that as soon as he came into power. So after some protests, he decided to reinstate this ministry, but as a special secretary. I'll share my screen really quick in here. He decided to put as a special secretary of culture, a actress known for having right right wing ideas. She's Regina Duarte. She was famous into she's a very famous actress in Brazil, and she became quite popular in 2002 during the election when she coined the phrase "I am afraid of the Workers' Party." And of course, she is being like quite vocal about Bolsonaro's ideas of ignoring social isolation. She actually published in her Twitter pictures of herself in a party, totally ignoring social isolation. She also was defending Bolsonaro, saying that if we stay with the economy closed, pretty much we're going to have an economic shutdown, and that will affect the life of people, and people will die, and so on and so forth. So she's being very vocal about promoting this type of ideas, because that's exactly what Bolsonaro is doing. He's just waiting for people to become desperate with the economy shut down and start demanding the economy to be open again, so he can say, I told you so, and he can again mobilize those people uh, to his favor, and win them in his favor. So he's basically just running the clock out. But as I said, she's been hiding, which inspired a lot of artists to start a campaign asking, "Where is Regina? Where is she?" So they started promoting online videos asking, where is she? Where is she? Where is she? What she's doing?" Because she's really not doing anything. The main fund that's responsible for the arts in Brazil, it's called the National Fund for Culture, and it is promoted by the Rouanet law, which is basically a tax incentive law. But since the minister of the secretary of culture hasn't done anything to release these funds to those who are in need, the cultural arts and the arts in Brazil has been totally paralyzed. And of course, with everything shut down, artists are not playing concerts, they are not doing exhibits, and it's quite a dire situation for them. So the question becomes, is there a way out of this? And we've been seeing a rise in the arts of people doing showings from their houses, broadcasting that online, concerts, and so on and so forth. I believe that the creation of the cyberspace, it's positive. However, for the artists, it's been very hard to monetize these endeavors. So perhaps in the long term, this will become something that's much more integrated to the way we conduct the arts in Brazil. Um, in the moment is just a way out, but it's not really, as I said, possible for these artists to monetize and to um, sustain themselves through this type of cyber environment. They need to be out there doing what they do best. And there's been people talking a lot about the cultural industry in Brazil, talking about the trying to politicize the idea. See, you say the culture is not necessary, but everyone's home watching movies or listening to music or reading a book. I just want to point out that's a very small part of what the arts are and what the arts represent, this cultural industry. Arts go much beyond this. Arts is a space of empowerment, it's a space where people can actually have a voice and create changes through it. And arts, it's also a vehicle for resistance, and for that reason, it's quite often coveted by the government or totally excluded by the government. So it's a very arts can be very dangerous in that sense, or very instigating. So that's the idea. So in Brazil, unfortunately, we haven't seen a response from the government. We've seen artists mobilizing themselves to try to do something, and the question becomes, for how long they can do this. And eventually, when the government reopens and things start going again, as I said, the arts and the concerts and theater, museums, events, and what have you will be the last one out of this crisis. So it's a quite a dire situation for arts and the artists in Brazil currently. We're seeing that many business in the arts are gonna go under after the economy opens up again, and the only ones that will probably survive are the ones that are not directly receiving funds from the government itself. So I'll give you an example of this before I finish. I'm the founder and the artistic director of a music festival in Brazil, and most of our funds come from not only the government but also from abroad. We run a call for scores, um, which we collect application fees from composers applying to our festival. And that's a way of using the economic situation with the rise of the dollar or the euro or what have you as a way of funding our festival in Brazil. So this is a model forward, thinking of giving independence to um, really breaking away from being held hostage by the government when it comes to funds, and just trying to do something that it's more globally oriented in Brazil. So that's what I have to say for Brazil and the arts. But just to recapitulate, the government hasn't done much. We have Secretary of Culture that's been hiding, and the situation, politically speaking and economically speaking, in Brazil, it's quite dire, and that will have a direct effect in the arts and the arts industry in Brazil. So thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you. Back to you, Daniel.
Okay, Jihani, are we going to hear from you as well?
Yes, thank you, Rafael. I hope you guys can hear me fine. I had some difficulties with internet connection today. Hmm. All right. I'm glad you guys can hear me. I can't seem to see what's going on the other side. But Rafael, you had a very good argument in the sense that our government, federal level, is not doing much, and a lot of decision making has been trickled down to the state governments. I'd be showing you guys a little bit of an insight on the state of Bahia, which is where I'm currently in. So in Salvador, for example, we had the government of state really release a campaign quite early on after the first related death in Brazil, which was on March 17th. And as of March 25th, we've started the quarantine. And despite Bolsonaro wanting to bring activities back to normal, um, they they kept the city under quarantine. And so we saw quite a rapid escalation here in Salvador, and can't speak generally for all of the state, but we saw quite a rapid reaction, and we saw everybody, to a certain extent, try to abide to the quarantine and take the proper precautions needed to both account for social distancing. Businesses were closed, shopping centers were closed, um, but we don't have strict enforced measures like one of our colleagues mentioned in Colombia. So people are still able to go out and walk around. And as we are approaching, I believe now, our fourth week, ending our fourth week and starting our fifth week of quarantine, we're starting to see a slight loosening of the isolation from the population. And that is mainly around certain social demographics. So in this slide here, I just contextualize the state of Bahia here around Brazil to showcase how many of the COVID cases have been in the state of São Paulo, and the deaths as well. So how do we compare in Bahia? We're at 209 cases and 73 deaths as of April 26th. And that is, of course, from data given by the Brazilian Ministry of Health. It's hard to really understand what this data represents and if it really represents the reality that we're actually living in. From informal references, I also understand that about only 10% of the beds in the ER rooms are currently occupied. And so there seems to be a want to coordinate with other cities in the state of Bahia and also of the Northeast to say how they can help some of the systems that are currently under a lot of pressure and not able to um, attain to the demand, and perhaps use some of the beds here that are currently available. So I was based out of Petrolina, Juazeiro, which is a city at the edge of Pernambuco and Bahia. Over there, it's an export-oriented agricultural economy, and it's interesting to compare first-handed what I've seen there and also what I'm seeing now in the coastal city of Salvador, which is an economy more so based on services and the tourism industry mainly. And even though in Petrolina mainly we see a dollarized economy, as exports of added value crops such as mangoes have been somewhat affected, we do see a effect into the local economy. In Salvador is quite drastic because with the tourism industry down, everything is closed, and we see a large segment of the population with no work, and all that's been provided for them as federal financial help is a total of 600 reais per individual a month, which doesn't cover. One can say that this does not cover the basic necessities. The the uh, the municipality of Salvador has also added a 270 reais for financial help of informal workers in the city. However, we also don't know how long they can continue with this help, and when it does stop, what does it really entail? Those who want to have access to these funds need to have proper documentation. So if individuals do not have proper IDs or a proper CPF, which is their equivalent of a social security number, they don't have access to these funds or this help. And as Rafael mentioned earlier, Brazil is not for the faint of heart. We were just getting out of the 2014 recession. We just started to see the economy show some some growth, and all of a sudden we get hit by the pandemic and also this political crisis that we're seeing with Bolsonaro and the resignation of Sergio Moro. So the dollar is at an all-time high, and we were expecting lower interest rates, but we don't really know what's to come now. So all this to say that Jair Bolsonaro has very little approval in comparison to some of the state leaders in Brazil based on his actions and reaction to the COVID crisis. The contingency plan for coping with the new coronavirus in Bahia claims to guarantee or suggests to guarantee access to health services in an equitable, comprehensive, and qualified manner through regulatory process. And we see the municipality of Salvador trying to create new health and care centers for people in situations of social vulnerability. But in practice, this isn't always necessarily implemented as one would hope. Nevertheless, earlier on during this pandemic, we did see Salvador gain some sort of international recognition for its practices against the coronavirus. But as we're, kind of starting to get into this phase where I'm going to come back to that slide, where the slogan and the communication, the campaign was really about, staying at home, to trying to transition to a situation where they're going to start loosening up the rules. And they're just more so incentivizing people to walk out and just use the proper precautions and use such of the mask. So this is also observed through the landscape as one walks or drives or bikes through, as we are able to do that at this moment, as long as we're avoiding the agglomeration of people. Nevertheless, this is not the case in all neighborhoods of Salvador. So here I just trying to illustrate an example between two neighborhoods just set a kilometer apart. The one above, which is the Bairro da Piedade, in the historic center. Currently, they're still holding what we call feiras, which is markets, and you sell produce. Small businesses are still open in these areas, and people are not using proper precautions. But we also don't see efforts from the local municipality to survey and enforce policies here. But below, you see Bairro de Vitória, which is one of the most expensive real estate that you'll find in Salvador. There is multiple attempts. Here is just an example of a cart that goes around and keeps screaming, "Stay at home. Coronavirus is killing people all over the world. Take the proper safety precautions for yourself and your society." So there is a difference in the way that the policies are implemented in these different neighborhoods, even though they are of close proximity. So we have seen social inequality, of course, being exacerbated during these times of crisis. Quarantine is not for the poor. Most people don't necessarily even have access to internet at home if they don't go out and to work and sell their fair share during the day. They cannot have the funds to even survive and pay for their meals. So it's a tricky question, and also there's a lot of conversation now about what is the world and what is Brazil going to look like post pandemic, right? And as we see a large segment of the population who just does not have the skill sets required to move towards a remote economy, so to say, which would require a basic level of fluency in English and software skills. There is a necessity to invest in this population segment to help them get access to jobs and resources that they wouldn't otherwise be able to fulfill in a world where this type of quarantine is imposed. So this is a bit of an insight, on the ground from Salvador. and from generally speaking from the state of Bahia. The case and the situations are different all over the country. I understand that there's even smaller municipalities that have not imposed any quarantine whatsoever. The mistake of what's going on in Brazil is quite different everywhere, and it's hard for us to make a generalization. Um, but yeah, that's what I had to contribute here today, and I'll pass it back on to Daniel.
Great. Thank you, Jihani, and thank you, Rafael, as well, for your presentations on Brazil. Now we're going to move on to our final speaker for today. Next, we'll be hearing from David Cordero Heredia, who is an alumnus of the Cornell Law School and a former last grad fellow, and he will be talking to us today about the situation in Ecuador.
Give me a second. I'm gonna share a presentation with you. Okay. Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about about the situation in Ecuador. First, I think we should start with a little bit of background of what is going on now in Ecuador. As you can see in this chart, Ecuador is the third country in Latin America with most cases of COVID-19. But if we compare with the rate of, if we compare with the population of the three countries with more cases, Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador, you can see that the rate, if we compare the number of confirmed cases and the population, Ecuador got 1.58 more contagious than Peru and 41 more cases that Brazil. Why is that happen? So let's just start talking about how was the country before the crisis. So in 2019, we got the budget crisis. We got some indicators about the economy, poverty, 25% of income on 38.1% of multidimensional poverty. Underemployment 27.25%, and unemployment in 5%. And that boost social conflict in late November 2019 because some economic measures that were proposed by the government that were meant to gain to sign a card with a country with the international fund. So we got two major measures that we got to take into consideration. First, the elimination of the gas subsidy. We got a cheap price of gas. However, the elimination of gas subsidy we're going to increase most of the first necessity goods in the society, especially gonna make an impact on the prices of transportation. And also there was a lot of policies to contract the size of the state, and one of the main sectors that were impacted by those policies were the health sector. These produced indigenous social movements collective actions in October 2018, and the October uprising closed the country for almost 2 weeks, and it was the rise of the conservative racial policy in Ecuador. Right now, the indigenous social movement is very treated by the middle class and the high class in the society, and and this impact the possibility of the movement and the left movements to dialogue with the state, and especially to produce or to impact in the social in the social idea of how to manage the economical crisis. And so we got a weak health sector and a weak economy before the COVID-19. This is an image of the October uprising. Though the indigenous woman that is using the mask is not using the mask because of the COVID-19, but because of the tear gas in the public manifestations. So the first response of the COVID crisis, well, we got the first confirmed case in February 29, and the restrictions start on March 13. The president started a constitutional state of exception, and it was used to close the government, the Congress, and the judiciary. A curfew was established, started at 2 p.m. in all the country. Cars can only be used once a week. No vehicles are allowed on weekends. We got problems with the data that the government is used to implement policies. We don't have enough tests. We have for almost a month only 3 recoveries on the data, and the statics are being corrected on the move in daily basis. This is an example. This is Wednesday, April 22, and this is April 24th. So in 2 days we got the double of the confirmed cases here, and that was because the government bought more tests. So they start to change in all the statistic data that they have, especially because they were determined where the government can be, or the country can be open again. Now we got a new announcement that the government that the activities will start to go to a new normal starting on the next Monday. However, the people are very concerned about what kind of data are informed this kind of decisions, especially because of the increasing of the cases. So the Guayaquil case is the most important crisis that we are handling in Ecuador. If we see the numbers, most of the cases are in this part of the city, Guayas, and this is the province where Guayaquil, the most populated and the biggest city of the country, is. So we got that Guayaquil is the most unequal city in the country. Guayaquil elites have been in permanent political campaign against the national authorities. So they are at the beginning. They start like fighting the national measures. The high class people start or continue doing parties, and we can identify that some of the main sources of spreading of the virus were those high class parties, and there is this closure of Guayaquil's airport that was covered all over the war, because the mayor of the city rejects the decision of the national government to allow some European people to return to Europe. So they closed the airport, putting some cars of the city in the field. And so what is making Guayaquil the most important case is about the informality of the economy, because because Guayaquil most of the people live doing some sales, street sales. The curfew was never fully implemented. There's so much people in the streets, and the police cannot control that. The social distance is almost impossible in a country with most of the people live 8 to 10 inhabitants in houses of 4+4 meters rooms. So the crisis is increasing, and maybe the most shocking news about Guayaquil is the corpses on the streets. There was no protocol to handle the corpses. The fear of COVID made people leave the bodies on the streets. There are mass graves ideas, but not fully implemented, and we got some resurrection cases. And well, the resurrection cases is because we are finding that some people is leaving the comas, leaving the hospitals, returning to their homes, and finding that their families have received some ashes for other people, or have been informed about people that, or they receive calls from the government saying that the loved ones just passed away, but they have already do the funeral like 3 weeks ago of the ashes of another person. So the government have not the capacity, has not the capacity to handle the number of deaths in Guayaquil. And did bring us to the topic of the law. So the government got this discourse about reality has exceeded legality, and the government is trying to resume the 2019 economical plans, but now with more force. Now they are already they're bringing again to the table the elimination of the gas subsidies. They are proposing the flexibility of labor contracts, the unilateral decreasing of public salaries, and the commerce chambers are proposing to eliminate the minimum wage of the workers. So that's true for one sector of the society, but the reality has exceeded legality is false for another part of the society. Especially the mass incarceration wasn't touched by any of these measures. The overpopulation in jails is a time bomb for the spreading of the disease. We already got some cases in jails. As in other societies with mass incarceration, the policies are the convicted are mainly because of drug crimes. So those are not the kind of people that is a danger for the society. So just to sum up my presentation, we had a health sector that was unfunded. We got poverty, underemployment, unemployment, low oil prices, and now COVID-19. So we had the perfect storm in the country. We got to face these new challenges, and the idea is to discuss as a society if we need more rights, if we need to rethink the health right, and how the state should intervene in the guarantee of individual rights, or we embrace all these neoliberal policies that more of the high class and the government is imposing. So as a conclusion, I think the right of health and the right to live with dignity should be respected during the crisis and beyond the crisis. And that is now the challenge that we deal in Ecuador. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all of our panelists for all of your presentations today. So for our remaining time, we are going to shift to a question and answer session. So I'm going to hand things over to Michael Carey, who is another one of our last fellows and a PhD student in development sociology, and he will be moderating the question and answer portion.
Hey everyone, for those attendees who want to ask questions, just a reminder to use the Q&A function, and then I will relay them to the panelists. We have a couple of questions so far. The first one is actually for you, David, if you would like to continue speaking. Paul Rule asks, how will government relief measures reach isolated rural communities like the indigenous in the Amazon basin?
So, indigenous population has been one of the groups less impacted by the measures, especially the ones that still live in communities, because they declare themselves into isolation during the crisis. And there was also a political movement because they are still producing goods for the cities, but especially in the Amazon basin, what is going on is that the indigenous peoples are rejecting the entrance of oil workers into the oil fields. So they are also doing a statement with their isolation. We are mainly worried about the indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation, because we got the news of Brazil that some of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation there have been um, contaminated by COVID-19. So Ecuador should have some more aggressive measures to protect the population in indigenous peoples in national isolation. But right now they got a protocol that basically says that if there is a case of indigenous people contagious with COVID-19, then they're going to stop the oil extraction that is going on in their territory. So that is going to be a disastrous for this population that we don't know if they have had the normal flu that we have, because they are not in contact with the Western world. So it's not enough what the government is going on in the Amazon basin. The next question is also for me, or no?
No, the next question is a general question for all the panelists, and it reads, many experts in the US are worried that reopening the economy and returning to routine daily life too quickly could lead to a second resurgence of contagion and another crisis. Do the panelists see this happening in Latin America? How are governments preparing to handle the transition to normal? I don't know if anyone would like to start.
If I may, let me just go back for 1 minute to the previous question, because in Colombia, although the government has put up front a large transfer program to, like I said, 3 million households, which is about a quarter of the population, getting specifically to indigenous groups across the country has been a little bit difficult, not only because most of these groups are isolated geographically, but also because most of this population is not into the financial system. So part of the problem is by quarantining everyone in the country and trying to give or make transfers available to poorest households. Part of the problem with indigenous groups has been a way to getting specifically resources, either financially or through food and other type of essential items. Particularly as one of the main programs in Colombia is giving food, breakfast, lunch, and in the afternoon, food for kids when they're in school. So to indigenous groups, this was a very important measure as their daily food taken by their kids. So right now, part of the issues in Colombia is how to help these regions and these indigenous communities still get into a hold of food and other necessary supplies so they can manage through this crisis. And going into the second question, which is what is the government thinking when reopening part of the sectors in the economy, I think there have been trying to see how the health issue is evolving around the country, trying to see which sectors and how they can manage to limit social contact, for example, within transportation infrastructure, bus, trains, or Transmilenio, as we call them in Colombia, which is basically a large system of buses. But specifically, this is what the government is gonna look at in the coming weeks as we start reopening some of these sectors. There's strict social measures for distancing and safety measures that companies have to implement if they want to reopen. But as everything else is just a matter of how do you track how overall the health issue is going in the country and specifically in certain regions, and how to manage to try to have some sectors reopen so the economy can still get into shape. So it's just I don't like to call it an experiment, as some people have put it in Colombia's news, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty into how things are gonna evolve and how to manage within the next 12 or 18 months.
So in São Paulo, for example, where they're going to start reopening, they're also having a gradual approach to reopening. We're not returning to normal daily routine. There's no going back to what used to be normal, and they're trying to also establish, mandatory use of masks, distancing when you enter commercial spaces, and it's not all establishments that will be open at once. It's they have a gradual opening of different commerce types. So if that, gives any insight of what's going on in Sao Paulo, and the tendency is that across Brazil, you'll see other major capitals following the same initiative if it works down there. There's also the mention of opening the cities. So within the state of Sao Paulo, they're opening the cities that are further away from the center, so from the capital city. And they're trying to open the cities with the less cases first before getting to the core.
Let me just make an observation on that, because with regards to São Paulo state, I mean, it's the largest, most populous state in the country. São Paulo city, population-wise, is larger than New York. We've been in quarantine for less than a month, and they are already talking about reopening the country. And that is when the epicenter of the pandemic is shifting from the United States to Latin America. They're already having problems dealing with social isolation, keeping people inside, collapsing of the health system, and that's nationally. And they're now trying to think about reopening the country. That is too soon. It's not controlled yet. We have no idea how this pandemic is going to play, especially because the government has downplayed this pandemic throughout the whole time and not really taking it seriously. So my hometown in São Paulo, unfortunately, is the city that had the least social isolation. Only 38% of the people were social isolating. It's in the countryside, yes. It's 2 hours away from São Paulo, but there is this sense, false sense of security, of safety in cities in the countryside, where people saying like, oh, it's mostly in São Paulo, it's not coming here, we have 1 or 2 cases in here. Yes, you have 1 or 2 cases, but the sub-notification and the lack of testing shows that, I mean, there are much more cases out there that we're just not aware of. So the potential for spread of this disease in the countryside is huge. And we know that in these smaller cities in the countryside, the health system is not so good. The hospitals are much smaller. They are not well equipped. Once it hits the countryside in Brazil, it's going to be devastating. So it's too soon I think it's really too soon to talk about reopening, especially because we have not enforced or came up with ideas to enforce good measures for social isolation and to slow down the spread of this disease.
We had another related question just come in that I think some of you have already started to cover, but someone has asked that the panelists compare and contrast what they're seeing in their own countries to what's happening in the United States. I don't know if anyone wants to speak on that very briefly.
Well, I've been watching every morning the governor comments in New York on how is the state going to plan on reopening. And basically what I see is what, at least in Colombia, they're trying to figure out on how to do, which is not only having the testing, tracing, isolating system, which will clearly depend on the capacity of in our case of the country and local governments to be able to rapidly test and isolate people who are contagious by the virus after the economy start reopening, but it's also on trying to get people to abide strictly to safety measures and companies. There is a lot of debate on and I know that it's risky is to start reopening some sectors of the economy, but we also have to be aware that as not only the World Health Organization has said, but also what I see daily to daily on the speeches many of the governors here in the United States said, we have to deal with this for the at least next year until we have a vaccine. So the governments have not only to deal with trying to reestablish some sectors of the economy because there's value chains attached to it, not only in agriculture, but other sectors which are essential for producing most of the goods that households need, but also because governments at the same time, they cannot keep people quarantined. And I'm going to attach that to one of the questions, which is not in the Q&A, but someone post in the chat, and is regarding the protests. In Colombia, we don't see protests starting to or having to do with political things. Some of the protests at the local level have been, and these have been small protests, in terms of some sectors not receiving government, national government or local sector, local government transfers, and also because sometimes they haven't been able to get into hold some for, I don't know, food or other necessary supplies that local governments are giving away to many poor districts. So these protests have been more in terms of they wanting to start working again because they depend on a daily wage, and or trying to tell the government they need more resources if they're going to be quarantined. But we have not seen what, for example, the people that pose the question says regarding Brazil. We have not seen these right or left wing protests being on and kind of just protests of people in Colombia trying to go back to work as they cannot keep doing the quarantine without wages or transfers from the national local government.
Okay, great. I think I'm being told we have time for one final question. So the last question is for the Brazil panelists and any others who want to chime in. It appears that in Brazil's Amazon region, the numbers of COVID cases are relatively low. Is this due to their isolation, or could it also be from the lack of testing allocated from the Bolsonaro administration? He's been vocal about his desire to strip the indigenous communities' autonomy. This contrasts to Colombia's Amazon region, which has the highest number of cases in their country.
Do you want to speak first, Jihan?
I was just gonna leave the word for you. I don't feel particularly able to answer to this question, so go ahead.
Yes, I think it's due to the lack of tests and due to mostly Bolsonaro not really caring about the indigenous populations. If something happened to them and they got wiped out of the map, I think he would be quite pleased. So yeah, I think the lack of tests. Another thing, the lack of tests plays in favor of Bolsonaro, right? So because his whole rhetoric has been saying that this is not a big deal, this is not a big crisis, the numbers are not that high. So if you're not testing and the numbers are low, that plays in favor of him, right? Because he can say, we've been testing, but look, the numbers are not enough. But we know Brazil hasn't been testing enough. United States been testing around, I think, 18,000 people per million, where in Brazil has been 239. So that gives you an idea of the discrepancy. So the cases in Brazil are probably 6, 7, 8 times higher than what's been put out there. So again, that is probably a strategy. Not testing people is probably a strategy to be able to control those numbers and downplay the gravity of this situation on Bolsonaro's part and his new health minister as well.
All right. So I think that we are out of time now for the question and answer session. But thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you to all the attendees. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you for making it today. But I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. If there's any other final words from anyone else, Ken or Bill, if you want to say anything before we wrap up.
And just give a big thank you to our graduate fellows for being panelists and organizers of this Public Issues Forum today. It's been very insightful and informative. And obviously, we know this is a very difficult period for Latin America and the world, but it's great for us to have an opportunity to learn more about what's taking place in the different countries. So we thank you all for sharing.